I think at this point, NES sequels have become a running joke on this channel. The first Castlevania was a modest success, becoming one of the most recognizable games on the NES. A year after the release of the first game, Castlevania II Simon's Quest was released in Japan in 1987, only 5 months after the series made its debut in North America. That's honestly shocking given how close both games were released. I imagine that Konami probably believed they had a new successful franchise under their belt and wanted to capitalize by immediately releasing a sequel. Simon's Quest, in terms of its reputation, has garnered a lot of mixed opinions over the years, which is funny because Simon's Quest was favorably received at the time of its release. But over the years, that opinion has changed with public opinion turning against Simon's Quest, no doubt thanks to many early YouTubers. In fact, those videos shaped my expectations for this review. That being said, I'm aware of the reputation Simon's Quest has. I know it goes for a more Metroidvania design, I know about the awful translation, and I know about the infamous crouch by a wall to summon a whirlwind. However, this video marks the first time I've completed Simon's Quest, so despite what I've heard, I'm looking forward to seeing what this game is about. Is it overhated like so many other NES sequels, or is it misunderstood as laid the groundwork for future Metroidvanias? Let's find out. To begin, I just have to bring this up again, but the fact that only a year after the release of Castlevania 1 in Japan, Akamatsu returning as the director began immediate work on a sequel. Like many NES sequels, it would drastically change the formula of the first game to offer a new experience. Believe it or not, when playing Simon's Quest for this video, I came to the realization that because of limited hardware at the time and short development cycles, game developers felt the need to experiment, which, in retrospect, is something I can respect, considering many publishers are constantly turning out the same crap every year, so I think it's comforting to know that there was a time when it was the norm. Though, to be fair, you could have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't know how to execute them properly, all your work falls flat, and I think Simon's Quest falls under that umbrella. Not to get too deep already, but if Simon's Quest had removed that one feature or rebalanced that one mechanic, this game's legacy would be remembered more favorably long term. Because Castlevania 2 is a sequel, we once again return in the shoes of Simon Belmont in his fight against the forces of darkness. 7 years after the defeat of Count Dracula in 1698, Simon Belmont, during his final battle with the Prince of Darkness, had a curse placed upon him that over the years will slowly but surely lead Simon to an early grave. Visiting his family's resting place, a young woman appears telling Simon that in order to undo the curse placed upon him, Simon must resurrect and defeat the Count by gathering all 5 pieces of his body scattered across Transylvania and burn them at the ruins of Castlevania. However, Simon doesn't have a long time to live, and with renewed vigor, he grabs the vampire killer once again and heads off on his new journey. Now, one thing I will praise Simon's Quest for is I really like the setup for its story. In the original Castlevania, the manual never went in depth to the backstory of the game. Hell, all of that was added later on. We're back in the reigns of Simon Belmont, and this time, he'll be the one resurrecting Dracula. It's interesting given that in future games, it's usually the followers of Dracula being the ones to resurrect the Count, but in this game, Simon is doing it to undo the curse placed upon him. In fact, Dracula's curse does play a role in the gameplay, so don't go thinking that it's something exclusive to the story. Out of all the times Dracula comes back in this series, this is the only time he can defeat Simon without directly fighting him, and it's kind of genius when you think about it. Sure, it'll take 7 years, but what's 7 years to someone immortal like Dracula? I won't lie, it is convenient that a woman appears telling Simon how to exactly undo the curse. Maybe the woman is Sarah, Leon Belmont's fiancée, given her sacrifice in Lament of Innocence gave the vampire killer its divine properties. Although that's entirely a theory on my end and holds no weight. Still though, the fact that Simon went 7 years holding in the curse is really impressive on his part. According to the game, the curse originates as a wound on Simon's back, so I can imagine the constant pain Simon is probably in, which might help explain the change in Simon's design. Gone is the Conan the Barbarian look, and instead Simon adapts a more traditional knight appearance, probably meant to hide his wound or make him appear more heroic. Probably the latter, because according to Castlevania lore, the Belmonts were outcasts of society, so Simon dresses like a knight to appear trustworthy, because some NPCs in game refuse to help Simon because he's a Belmont. If you wait at the title screen for a bit, you'll get an explanation that reads like a movie description, only meant to tell you the basics before you press the start button. Where do I begin with Simon's Quest? When you press the start button, you begin your journey in the town of Joba. Now already, Simon's Quest presents itself as a different game than its predecessor. When writing this part of the video, I realized instead of looking at Simon's Quest as an action platformer, I had to look at it from the perspective of a Metroidvania. Sort of. No longer are you going from level to level defeating a boss like before. Your goal is to explore, quote-unquote Transylvania and find the 5 mansions to retrieve a piece of Dracula's body. What I meant by sort of is Simon's Quest on the surface might appear to be a Metroidvania, but make no mistake, it's just as linear as the first game. That's because on the surface, Simon's Quest gives you the illusion of choice. On your way to the first mansion, you're presented with 2 branching pathways. Now you can go straight to the first mansion, or what you're really supposed to do is head to Veros and grab the chain whip. That way you'll stand a chance against the harder enemies. With that being said, I'll come out and say it, I consider Simon's Quest to be unfortunately a guide game. You can talk to NPCs in towns to gain a hint, but I'll be honest with you guys, not once during my playthrough did I ever stop and talk to the townspeople, because their hints are either useless or downright misleading. I think Simon's Quest is the worst kind of guide game. One where every part of your playthrough is spent looking at a guide because otherwise you're screwing yourself over. So then the question is, how did a kid without the internet in the 80s manage to play Simon's Quest? Well, if you were a kid back then, you most likely owned the issue of Nintendo Power that focused its second issue on Simon's Quest. And for this video, I actually went and read the guide. And to be honest, it actually contained a lot of tips that helped me during the early game, like telling me to instantly get the white crystal and displaying the path to the first mansion. I was genuinely shocked the guide contained detail covering all the way to the 3rd mansion, with each page telling you how to get there, on top of having detailed maps, including the locations of invisible blocks, because God knows they really enhanced the level design. Even though I wasn't alive when this was published, I felt a strange bit of nostalgia looking through this. I like how publishers back then created guides on how to beat their games. And yeah, it was probably done to increase sales in Nintendo Power, but still, you have to at least give credit to the effort put forward. Still, forgetting about guides for a moment, Simon's Quest never gives you an incentive to explore the entire map. A hallmark of a good Metroidvania is how getting a new ability opens up pathways that were previously inaccessible. Simon's Quest never has moments like those. Instead, it's more like a checklist of items you have to get in order to get the next one. I know some of you are saying, what about needing the blue crystal to get the red crystal? To which my counter-argument is that both items are mandatory to proceed further. I'm talking more on the lines of Metroid and how those games implement their mechanics. That's why the best strategy to employ is to never put yourself in a position where you never have to backtrack, because yeah, now comes one of Castlevania 2's newest features. In the inventory screen on the top right will display the time of day. Every 12 in-game hours, the time of day will change between day and night. When nighttime falls, enemies will drop more hearts than usual, making nighttime great for grinding hearts, which I did on several occasions to afford certain items, and townsfolk will barricade themselves indoors, making Simon unable to access them. How this affects the overall gameplay is dependent on how long it takes for you to beat the game, and what ending you'll get. To get the best ending, you have to enter Castlevania in 7 days or less, and in order to do that, you pretty much have to play a perfect playthrough of Simon's Quest. Time management is very important if you want to get the best ending. Sure, you can take your time, but Simon's Quest isn't no Majora's Mask when it comes to time management. On paper, I like the idea of the day-night cycle. Hell, nowadays it's a common thing we see in video games, but I think the way it was executed feels like if they had rebalanced it a little more or removed the time limit, then it could have been a unique addition. As it stands, the time limit only exists as a way to artificially inflate the game's difficulty, because everything I do is centered around how efficient I am at time management. To give an analogy, there's never a moment in Simon's Quest where you can stop for a moment and smell the roses. You're always on the move, heading to your next destination, only stopping to get essential items. That's why you haven't seen footage of me talking to regular NPCs, because all they do is waste time, and wasting time is how you screw yourself over out of getting the best ending. To at least balance it out, the timer won't tick if you're in a building or inside a mansion, but when you're in town, it can be a massive pace breaker, especially when you need an item for progression, like it happened to me when I wanted to get the red crystal. And lastly, to some people, the transition between day and night takes too long, but the easiest explanation is it's the game's way of loading in important assets. In fact, there are more annoying things than Simon's Quest. For one, Simon hasn't changed between games, and some features were made worse in this game. In the first game, if Simon took damage on stairs, he'd not be knocked off. But for the sake of difficulty or bad programming, Simon in Castlevania 2 can fall off stairs, potentially falling into more damage. Stairs in the first game were never annoying, but Simon's Quest made me understand the bad reputation they have. Sometimes you can be caught in a scenario where enemies wait at the top of stairs, forcing you to take damage like it happened to me in this example when I was down to 1 HP. You still can't control Simon's mid-air momentum, and for some reason, If you use the whip while jumping, Simon will get a boost in airtime, which is required to jump on these floating blocks. Worst of all, if you jump on a screen transition, Simon will carry his momentum, and if you do it at the wrong place, yeah. Now, I know graphics in the grand scheme of things don't matter. I'm of the belief a good art style can make a game timeless, regardless of what console it was on. But I don't know, man. Simon's Quest is a really ugly game. Castlevania 1 had such a great art style and sprite work, adding to the overall game. But in Simon's Quest, the graphics feel like they were downgraded, looking all muddied and lacking the color the first game had. The UI is more minimalist this time, only displaying your health, but my criticism with the inventory screen lies in that navigating it is really tedious. Having you press down twice to equip a sub-weapon and from there pressing up to equip an item, it's just really confusing and tedious because sometimes you'll want to change a sub-weapon but accidentally change your item by mistake. Lastly, if I could say this in the nicest way possible, Simon's Quest is really boring. To be self-conscious for a moment, the gameplay you've seen in this video is pretty much what Simon's Quest has to offer. You move right across the overworld, with the occasional enemy, and that's it. There's no mini-bosses in the overworld, and maybe one or two set pieces. It honestly makes repeated playthroughs more tedious because of this game's multiple issues. At the very least, I should offer a solution to the problem if I'm going to criticize it. Now, I'm no game developer, I'm just giving my own suggestions, so depending on your point of view, what I'm about to say can either be good or bad. Okay? For one thing, I would change how the body parts affect what ending you get. In my new system, you can enter Castlevania without getting every body part, with the minimum requirement being 2 pieces to enter Dracula's chamber. And for every 2 pieces you have will affect the final boss's difficulty and ending. If you have 2 pieces, the final boss will be easy, but you'll get the worst ending. Whereas if you have all 5 pieces, the final boss will be more difficult, but you're rewarded with the best ending. That way, Simon's Quest can emphasize more of its Metroidvania characteristics, giving the player the HT to end the game whenever they want, which could have been a unique selling point for the game because to my knowledge, no other game at the time did that. To go further, I'd also rebalance how the day-night cycle works. I'd keep in the in-game time limit, that way it still complements the story, but I'd increase the time limit to 18 days. And if you go past that limit, you'd get a normal game over and be sent back a week in-game time. Very similar to Majora's Mask, giving you a bit of leeway. Some of you might say it makes the game too easy, but I think it lets the player learn more about the game, letting them explore without feeling too much external pressure. On top of that, I'd also change how towns work. In every town, there's an inn or equivalent where Simon for a price could rest for the night. You still make NPCs unavailable at night, however, you at least have the option to skip to morning and avoid standing around in towns. That might sound like I'm making nighttime less important, but in fact, I'm making it more risk versus reward. Enemies are harder at night, but they drop more hearts, and you make it certain items only can be obtained at night, making the player consider more deeply about how they want to spend their time. Do you want to grind for hearts and get an optional item only available at night, or do you want to skip to morning? There's also a lot of minor things you can do, like making certain items more important. For example, Dracula's ring doesn't offer any bonuses when equipped. What I'd do is change it to where, when equipped, it would slow down the in-game clock, giving you more time to backtrack and obtain items you previously missed near the endgame, thereby incentivizing Simon's Quest RPG mechanics, making you ask if you want the protection of the shield or the time-slowing abilities of the ring. This time around, Simon's Quest really emphasizes its RPG mechanics than its predecessor, using a level-up system and different items with unique properties. However, it falls under the trapping that while Simon's Quest has legitimately good ideas, they suffer as the result of poor implementation. I think a main reason is the result of the short development time between Castlevania 1 and 2. To be honest, I don't blame Akamatsu for how Simon's Quest turned out. To me, it feels like Simon's Quest was rushed out the door once Konami saw the success of the first game. Remember, Simon's Quest released in Japan the same time the original made its debut in North America. I feel like if Konami gave Akamatsu the time needed to refine Simon's Quest, then I guarantee it would have been remembered more fondly, adding its own twist to the Metroidvania genre. However, that can't be said about the mansions or dungeons in this game. There are a total of 5 dungeons scattered around Transylvania, and you'll have to find them and navigate them to obtain one of Dracula's parts. Finding them will require a bit of puzzle solving, and my issue with that falls under the same problems I have with the overworld, requiring you to use a guide in order to find where they are. Once you do manage to find a mansion, Simon's Quest takes on a more Zelda-like formula, having you traverse the dungeon and find an item exclusive to the dungeon that's used to obtain a body part. On paper, that sounds great. I mean, the Zelda series is one of my favorite franchises, so this sounds like something right up my alley. Except, imagine if you take every part that makes for a good Zelda dungeon and water it down to the point where you make the dungeons in Zelda 2 look like masterpieces by comparison. I know that's a serious statement, but Zelda 2 is the only real comparison I have. I think the mansions in Simon's Quest suffer from the same lack of polish like the rest of the game. In every mansion, there's an NPC you have to find that sells an oak stake. After you purchase it, your nest has to find your way to the chamber holding one of Dracula's parts and use a stake to break the pearl, and you'll be doing that for all 5 mansions, resulting in a lack of variety in their gameplay loop. On top of that, you're never given an incentive to explore. You're always trying to find the stake merchant and then immediately head to the final chamber, which, by the way, once completed, you'll have to backtrack all the way to the entrance, which could have been avoided if they placed an exit or a teleporter taking you back to the entrance. I also would have liked a map to be included, and while I know the Nintendo Power Issue had detailed maps, an in-game one would have been nice, and like the rest of the game, I'd redesign how the mansions fundamentally work. I'd first redesign all the mansions to not be mazes, but instead be linear and structured like how levels worked in Castlevania 1, catering to players who played the original and would divide Simon's Quest into 2 gameplay styles, the non-linear overworld and the linear mansions. Next, I'd remove the stake vendor altogether. Instead, I'd have every dungeon boss drop one of the original sub-weapons, while still keeping the same ones found in the overworld. Oh yeah, bosses are in Castlevania 2, like the returning Death and newcomer Camilla. Beyond that, there's nothing much to say because bosses are painfully easy, and the simple solution is to have bosses from the first game return to fill in the slots. I know it seems like this entire video I've been harping on Simon's Quest, but if you remember what I said, I believe Simon's Quest had legitimately good ideas. Maybe what I've said was implemented in fan games over the years, which I am aware of, by the way. For now, I want to focus on the original release, and once I become more experienced with Castlevania, I'll check them out. But right now, the only thing left to do is head to the ruins of Castlevania. From the 5th mansion, make your way to the lower eastern side of the map and past the town of Yomi to enter the bridge to Castlevania. And inside, the timer stops once you step foot into the ruins. There are no enemies to speak of, so if you want, you could stop for a moment and take in the atmosphere. Your goal is to head to an underground altar where you'll resurrect Dracula. Inside, you approach the altar, and Dracula's 5 parts leave Simon's possession, and the Count is resurrected once again. Now the final battle begins, and Dracula is more dangerous this time, possessing... oh, never mind. From there, the game ends with Simon having vanquished the curse and ending the threat of Dracula, for now. For this being my first experience with Simon's Quest, there were moments where I was very harsh, but also tried to see what could have been improved. At the same time, Simon's Quest has not aged well over the years, especially with better Metroidvanias in this series. I know there are fan games out there that probably improved the overall game, but to give my verdict on Simon's Quest, I think you're better off skipping it and going straight to Castlevania 3, which is the next game I'll be covering. And to be honest, that's all I have to say. So in other words, thank you for watching, and take care.